My name is Frank Peterson. I'm 56 years old, and for 34 of those years, I've worked as a lineman for the utility company that keeps the lights on here in the Idaho Panhandle. I'm not a storyteller. I'm the guy who climbs a pole in a blizzard so your furnace keeps running. I deal in copper wire, ceramic insulators, and hydraulic fluid. My world is made of measurable things: voltage, amperage, tensile strength, and the number of hours until the next storm front hits. I've always been a skeptic, not out of any philosophical stance, but because my job requires it. You don't guess about a hot line, you test it. You don't hope a knot will hold, you tie it right. You trust what you can see, measure, and prove. That's why telling this is so damn hard. It goes against every practical bone in my body. The story I'm about to tell you involves things I can't measure and can't prove. And for a long time, I couldn't even admit it to myself. I've lived in Kootenai County my whole life. I've hunted, fished, and hiked these mountains since I was a boy. I know the sound of a bull elk bugling in a distant canyon and the smell of ponderosa pine baking in the July sun. I know what a black bear looks like when it crashes through the underbrush, and what a mountain lion's tracks look like in mud. I'm telling you this so you understand I'm not some city slicker who got spooked by an owl. What I saw twice, 20 years apart, and it has permanently changed my relationship with the wilderness I once called home. I'm sharing this now because my kids are grown, and the second incident involved them. It stopped being just my story then. It became a warning I feel I have to pass on. I know how it'll sound. I've played the scene over in my head 1,000 times, trying to find a different explanation. A bear with mange, a man in a suit, a trick of the light. None of them fit, not even close. Before I get into what happened, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I don't do this often, but when I do, it's because it's something that needs to be said. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I always like to know who's listening, to know I'm not just shouting into the void with this. All right, let me tell you what happened. It's important you hear it just the way it was. The first time was in late October of 1998. The tamaracks had all turned that brilliant gold they get just before they lose their needles, and the sky had that flat, heavy gray look it gets before the first real snow. We'd had a windstorm blow through a couple of days prior. Nothing major, but enough to knock some branches onto the lines. My job was to do a patrol run on a secondary transmission line that snaked up through a deep drainage east of Hayden Lake. It's rugged country back there. The service road is little more than 2 gravel ruts carved into the mountainside, and the power line right-of-way is a straight, ugly scar cut through miles of dense forest. It's not a place people go for fun. On that particular afternoon, I was alone. That wasn't unusual. It was a simple visual inspection, and sending 2 guys would have been a waste of manpower. I had my Ford F-250 utility truck, my tools, and a thermos of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. The air was cold and damp, holding the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. Every sound was muffled by the thick, low-hanging clouds. The only consistent noise was the low, almost sub-audible hum from the power lines overhead, a sound so familiar to me it was like my own heartbeat. I'd driven about 5 miles up the service road and got out to walk a section where the clearing was too narrow for the truck. I had my hard hat on, my leather work gloves, and my lineman's belt, though I didn't expect to be climbing anything. It was just habit. I walked along, my steel-toed boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel and fallen leaves. My eyes were up, scanning the insulators on the poles, looking for cracks or flash marks, checking the sag of the wires. Everything looked fine. It was a routine day, bordering on boring. That's when I first noticed the quiet. It's a specific kind of quiet you only get deep in the woods. It's not just the absence of man-made noise. It's the absence of natural noise, too. The squirrels, which are usually a constant, chattering nuisance, were silent. No chipmunks skittering across the rocks. No birds. Not a single jay squawking or a chickadee chirping. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. I've been in the woods when a predator is nearby, a bear or a big cat, and there's a certain tension, a localized hush. This was different. This was a blanket of silence that felt miles wide. It was heavy. My boots on the gravel sounded like gunshots in the stillness. A little prickle of unease started on the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched is a cliché, I know, but that's the only way to describe it. It felt like I'd walked onto a stage, and 1,000 unseen eyes were on me. I stopped and slowly scanned the tree line on both sides of the right-of-way. The forest was thick with cedar, fir, and pine, so dense that just a few feet in, it was all deep shadow and gloom. I saw nothing, just trees. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. You're just spooking yourself, Frank. I took a swig of my cold coffee and kept walking, but my pace was slower now, more deliberate. I was no longer just looking up at the lines. My head was on a constant swivel. Every dark shape between the trees looked like something. A burnt stump became a crouching bear. A tangle of roots became a coiled mountain lion. My brain was trying to put a familiar name to the source of my fear. It's a defense mechanism, I suppose. If you can name it, you can deal with it. But there was nothing there. The silence persisted. The hum of the power lines overhead seemed to get louder, filling the vacuum. I reached the next pole, number 74, and did a quick check around its base. Everything was normal. I made a note on my clipboard. That's when I heard it. To my right, deep in the woods, maybe 50 yards in, there was a loud, sharp crack. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch. It was the sound of a thick, living limb being snapped in half. It was a sound of force, of immense strength. A bull elk could do it, maybe, but it was the wrong time of year for them to be fighting and crashing through the woods like that. A bear could do it, but it sounded intentional. I froze, listening. The silence that followed was even deeper than before. I unsnapped the safety strap on the holster of the .357 Magnum I carried on my hip. It was standard procedure for us working in the back country, mainly for cougars. I'd never had to draw it in my life. My heart was starting to beat a little faster now. I told myself it was a bear, a big one, probably just as spooked by me as I was by it. I started walking back toward my truck, moving slowly, deliberately. I didn't run. You don't run from a predator. I kept my eyes on the spot where the sound had come from. The shadows were getting longer as the afternoon wore on, and the flat gray light was starting to fade. Another 100 feet to the truck. Then I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. It was the sound of something heavy moving through the brush, paralleling me. It wasn't the clumsy crash of a bear or the 4-footed gait of a deer or elk. It was bipedal. It was a heavy thump, thump, thump of 2 feet hitting the soft forest floor. Each step was too far apart to be a man. The stride was enormous. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. A poacher? A hunter in big boots? But who would be this deep in the woods, off-trail, making that much noise? And the feeling of being watched was intensifying, becoming a palpable pressure against my skin. I stopped again, and the footsteps in the woods stopped too. Dead silence, except for the buzzing of the wires and the frantic drumming in my ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand resting on the grip of my revolver. I could feel the cold, checkered steel against my sweaty palm. I was 50 yards from my truck, 50 yards from a steel box with a running engine that could get me out of there. It felt like 50 miles. I knew I had to move. Staying put was not an option. I took a slow step backward, my eyes glued to the dense wall of trees. And that's when I saw it for the first time. It wasn't a sudden appearance. It was more like my eyes finally adjusted to see what was already there. A section of the deep shadow detached itself from the other shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, and lean. My first thought, and I remember this clearly, was, that's a person in a ghillie suit. A hunter, maybe, playing a stupid prank. But it was 7, maybe 8 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the waist too narrow. It was standing just inside the tree line, partially obscured by the trunk of a massive cedar. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette against the gloom. It was perfectly still. It wasn't a bear. A bear standing on its hind legs is a pear-shaped thing, bulky and bottom-heavy. This was built more like a man, but a distorted, elongated one. I stared, my brain refusing to process the image. The rational part of me was cycling through possibilities at lightning speed. Stump, shadow, man, bear, and rejecting them all. The primal part of me, the part that's been hiding from things with teeth since the dawn of time, was screaming one word: wrong. This was fundamentally wrong. I slowly raised my hand and fumbled for the big maglite on my belt. My fingers were numb and clumsy. I clicked it on, and the powerful beam cut a clean white circle in the graying light. I pointed it at the shape. The light hit it, and for a second, it didn't move. And then it took one slow step forward, out from behind the cedar tree. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't a man in a suit. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a creature that had no right to exist. It was covered in coarse, matted fur the color of dark, wet earth. It wasn't thick like a bear's, but shaggier, like a wolf's. Its body was a horrifying mix of canine and human. It had long, powerful legs that were bent backward at the knee like a dog's, but it stood upright on 2 feet. Its arms were long, too long, and ended in what looked like oversized human hands, but with thick, dirty yellow claws instead of fingernails. But the head was the worst part. It was the head of a wolf or a German shepherd, but scaled up to a monstrous size. It had a long muzzle filled with teeth I could see even from 50 yards away. The lips were pulled back in a silent, neutral expression that was somehow more terrifying than a snarl. It had tall, pointed ears that swiveled slightly, tracking the tiny sounds of my own terrified breathing. And its eyes. When the beam of my flashlight hit its face, the eyes glowed with a sickening, reddish-orange light. Not the bright green of a cat or the pale white of a deer. It was a deep, fiery gold, like embers in a dying fire. And they were intelligent. That was the thing that broke me. They weren't the flat, instinctual eyes of an animal. They were looking at me, with a calm, analytical curiosity. It knew I was there. It knew I was afraid. It tilted its head, just a fraction, a gesture so unnervingly familiar, so canine, that it seemed absurd on a creature of that size and posture. In that moment, time seemed to stretch and warp. It felt like I stood there for a full minute, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand, my entire world reduced to that impossible creature and the humming of the wires overhead. It was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. My mind just shut down. The part of my brain responsible for fight or flight was screaming both options at once, and the result was a complete system lock-up. I was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare. The creature didn't move either. It just stood there, watching me, letting me see it. There was no aggression in its posture, no threat display. It was just there. Its stillness was the most terrifying thing about it. It was confident. It was in its element, and I was the one who was out of place. It was the apex predator on this mountain, and we had just been formally introduced. Its chest, which I could now see was powerfully muscled beneath the shaggy fur, rose and fell with slow, even breaths. I could see the faint vapor of its exhalations in the cold air. The sheer biological reality of it was what was so staggering. This wasn't a ghost or a spirit. This was a living, breathing thing of flesh and bone, a piece of North American fauna that wasn't in any of the books. And I was standing 50 yards away from it with a handgun that suddenly felt like a child's toy. I remember a strange, detached thought floating through my panic. No one is ever going to believe this. The thought was so absurdly mundane that it almost broke the spell. It was the thought of a practical man trying to file a report on the unbelievable. Who do you call for this? Animal control? The sheriff? I could picture their faces, the polite disbelief, the quiet phone call to my supervisor suggesting a drug test. And then the creature took another step. It moved with a fluid, silent grace that was shocking for something so large. It didn't lumber, it flowed. One of its long, clawed hands reached out and rested on the trunk of a young fir tree beside it. I saw the claws, black and thick as railroad spikes, sink slightly into the bark. It wasn't an aggressive move. It was casual, like a man leaning against a wall. That casualness, that human-like gesture, was the final straw. It broke my paralysis. A single clear thought cut through the terror. Truck. I had to get to the truck. I didn't turn and run. Some deep, instinctual part of me knew that was the worst possible thing to do. I started backing away, one slow, deliberate step at a time. I kept the flashlight beam pinned on its eyes, never breaking contact. My boots crunched on the gravel, the sound deafening in the charged silence. The creature watched me, its head turned, following my movement. Its glowing eyes never left mine. It didn't follow. It didn't snarl. It just stood there, letting me go. Every step backward was an exercise in controlled terror. My legs were shaking so badly, I was afraid I would fall. My heart was a frantic hammer against my ribs. I could feel the cold sweat running down my back and pasting my shirt to my skin. I kept backing up, step after agonizing step. 40 yards to the truck. 30. The creature remained at the edge of the woods, a towering dark shape against the deeper dark behind it. Its silence was a psychological weapon. A charge, a roar, a threat. I could have understood that. But this calm, intelligent observation was something my mind had no framework for. It was watching me like a scientist watches a microbe under a microscope. I finally reached the driver's side door of my F-250. My hand, trembling violently, fumbled for the handle. I didn't dare take my eyes off the thing in the woods. I found the handle, pulled it, and the click of the latch echoed in the quiet clearing. I slid into the seat, my body moving stiffly, mechanically. I grabbed the door and pulled it shut, the solid thump offering the tiniest sliver of security. I risked a glance away from the tree line for a fraction of a second to jam the key into the ignition. My hand was shaking so much it took 2 tries. The engine turned over, roaring to life and shattering the silence. The headlights flashed on, illuminating the right-of-way in a brilliant white glare. I slammed the gear shift into drive and stomped on the gas pedal. The big truck fishtailed on the loose gravel, tires spitting rocks, before lurching forward. As the truck swung around, The headlights swept across the spot where the creature had been standing. It was gone. The space was empty. There was no sound of it crashing through the underbrush, no sign it had ever been there. It had vanished back into the shadows as silently as it had appeared. I didn't slow down. I drove down that mountain road faster than I ever had before, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes wide, constantly checking the rearview mirror. The dense forest crowded in on both sides, the trees like black walls in the growing darkness. Every shadow looked like it was moving. I expected to see it step out into the road in front of me at any moment, or to see those glowing eyes appear in my mirror, keeping pace with the truck. But there was nothing, just the empty, dark road behind me. When my tires finally hit the paved county road at the bottom of the mountain, a wave of something, relief, shock, hysteria, washed over me. I pulled over, killed the engine, and just sat there in the sudden silence, shaking. My whole body was trembling, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in my bones. I put my head down on the steering wheel and took deep, ragged breaths, the plastic smelling of sweat and fear. I tried to rationalize it again. A bear. It had to be a bear. A big one, standing on its hind legs, and the dim light and my fear had twisted it into something else. But the eyes, the hands, the dog-like legs. No, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I had a name for. I drove home in a daze. The familiar world of streetlights, houses, and other cars felt like a foreign country. I walked into my house, and my wife took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I looked like I'd seen a ghost, she said. I couldn't tell her. I mumbled something about a near miss with a logging truck on the highway. I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud, because saying them would make it real. For the next few weeks, I was a wreck. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing, intelligent eyes staring back at me. Every creak of the house at night was the sound of it outside my window. I jumped at every shadow. I called in sick to work twice, something I had never done. I couldn't face going back up into those mountains. My supervisor was concerned, asked if everything was all right at home. I told him I had the flu. The lie felt flimsy and foolish. I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. I had to know if I was crazy. About 10 days after the incident, I asked my buddy, another lineman named Jim, to go for a drive with me. I told him I thought I'd seen signs of poachers up on that service road and wanted a second pair of eyes. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning. The world felt safe and normal in the full sunlight. We drove up the same road, and my anxiety grew with every turn. When we got to the spot, I felt a knot of ice form in my stomach. We got out and walked the right of way. I took him to the place where I had seen it. We looked for tracks, for any sign. The ground was covered in a thick mat of pine needles and leaves. We found a few scuffed-up areas, some indentations in the soft earth, but nothing that looked like a clear print. A recent rain had washed away any details. I pointed out a few broken branches high up on a fir tree, much higher than a man could reach. Jim just shrugged. "Wind does weird things," he said. He looked at me, a little concerned. "You sure you're okay, Frank? You seem on edge." I just nodded and said I was fine. We found nothing, no proof, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had happened. In a way, it was worse than finding something. It fed the part of my brain that was trying to convince me I had imagined it all, that I'd had some kind of waking nightmare or a small seizure. For 20 years, I lived with that uncertainty. The memory never faded completely, but it softened. It became a story I told only to myself, a piece of personal folklore. I learned to function again. I went back to work, back into the mountains. But I was never the same. I never worked alone in a remote area again, if I could help it. I always made sure to be out of the deep woods before dusk. The wilderness was no longer just a place of beauty and solitude for me. It now held a deep and menacing secret. Years passed. Life went on. I got promoted to a supervisor role, which meant more time in the office and less on the poles, something I was quietly grateful for. My kids grew up, went to college, and started their own lives. The encounter on that service road became a distant, surreal memory. I had almost convinced myself that it was a trick of the light, a product of an overtired mind in a spooky setting. I'd relegated it to the same mental box as a bad dream. Then, in the summer of 2018, the box was ripped open. My son, Mark, was 22 at the time. He and 3 of his friends decided to go camping for a weekend up by a remote part of Lake Pend Oreille. It was a spot they'd been to before, a small, unofficial campsite, accessible only by a rough Forest Service road. He was an experienced outdoorsman. I'd taught him myself. I wasn't worried. He called me Saturday afternoon, his voice tight with a fear I had never heard from him before. He was whispering. "Dad," he said, "you need to come get us. Now." I felt a jolt of cold dread. "What's wrong? Is everyone okay?" "We're okay," he whispered. "But, Dad, there's something out here. It was here all last night. It's big. It walked around our camp for hours. We saw it." My blood ran cold. I knew. Before he even described it, I knew. "What did it look like, son?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying none of the panic that was clawing its way up my throat. "I don't know," he stammered. "It's huge. It walks on 2 legs. We saw it on the ridge this morning when the sun came up. It looks like a wolf, but it was standing up like a person. Dad, I'm not crazy. We all saw it." I closed my eyes. 20 years dissolved in an instant. I was back on that right-of-way, the smell of damp earth in my nose, staring into those intelligent, glowing eyes. "Stay in your tent. Don't make a sound," I said, my voice all business now. "I'm on my way. I'll be there in an hour and a half." I grabbed the keys to my truck, but before I left, I went to the gun safe. I bypassed the .357 and took out the .44 Magnum I had bought a decade earlier. I also grabbed my 12-gauge pump-action shotgun and a box of heavy slugs. As I drove north, breaking every speed limit, my mind was a maelstrom. The fear was there, cold and familiar, but it was overshadowed by a hot, protective rage. This thing was not just a ghost from my past anymore. It was terrorizing my son. The drive was the longest 90 minutes of my life. When I finally turned onto the dirt road leading to the campsite, I slowed down, scanning the woods on either side. The sun was high in the sky, but the forest still felt dark, watchful. I pulled up to their camp and saw the 4 of them huddled together by their cold campfire, looking pale and terrified. They practically sprinted to my truck. I got out, shotgun in hand. "Everyone get in," I said. "Leave the gear." Mark pointed a trembling finger toward a high, rocky ridge that overlooked the small clearing. "It was up there, Dad, this morning, just watching us." I looked up at the ridge, and I saw it. It was standing in the dappled shade of a cluster of pine trees, maybe 300 yards away. It was broad daylight, no tricks of the light, no confusing shadows. It was just as I remembered, tall, impossibly lean, covered in dark, matted fur. It was standing with that same casual posture, one hand resting on a tree trunk. Even from that distance, I could make out the canine head, the pointed ears, the long muzzle. It was just watching. It knew we were there. It knew I was looking at it. There was no fear in its stance, only a quiet, unnerving confidence. It was acknowledging me. A silent message passed between us across that valley. I'm still here. This is my home, not yours. The rage in my chest turned back to cold, hard fear. Seeing it again, after all those years, confirmed everything. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. This creature was real, and it had been haunting these mountains for at least 2 decades, maybe longer. I hustled the kids into my truck and threw it in reverse. I didn't take my eyes off the ridge until we were back on the main road. Mark and his friends were quiet on the ride home. They were in shock. I finally told them. I told them about my encounter in 1998, a story I had never shared with another living soul. As I spoke, I could see the mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension on their faces. They had been trying to rationalize what they saw, just as I had. Hearing my story gave their experience a terrifying context. It wasn't a one-time freak event. It was a pattern. We reported it, of course. We had to. We called the sheriff's office and Fish and Game. I told a heavily edited version of the story. I said we'd been stalked by a very large, aggressive, and unidentifiable animal. I left out the part about it walking on 2 legs and having hands. I knew how that would sound. A deputy came out, took our statements. He was polite, professional, but deeply skeptical. He wrote it down as a possible problem black bear. A few days later, a Fish and Game officer called me. He said they'd gone up to the campsite, found the abandoned gear. They found some large, unidentifiable tracks, but they were too scuffed to make a plaster cast. He said it was probably a bear, and that we were lucky it had only been curious. He advised us to be more careful about food storage in the future. The case was closed. It was a non-event, just 4 scared kids and 1 overprotective father. But I knew what we saw. We all did. That second sighting changed everything for me. It was no longer a personal trauma I could bury. It was an ongoing reality. This thing, whatever it is, shares these woods with us. It watches us. And for the most part, it seems to let us be. But not always. And there's no official channel, no government agency you can turn to for help when you encounter something that isn't supposed to exist. You are utterly, completely on your own. So, why am I telling this now to strangers on the internet? Because I'm done being silent. For 20 years, I let the fear of ridicule keep me from speaking the truth. I let the official narrative, the one where everything has a neat, scientific explanation, override the evidence of my own eyes. But after seeing the look on my son's face, I can't do that anymore. These woods, as beautiful as they are, hold secrets. They are not empty. That feeling you sometimes get, that prickle on the back of your neck that says you're being watched. You should listen to it. Don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it away. We are not the only intelligent species walking through these mountains. I don't know what these things are. I've spent countless late nights online, reading theories. Are they some undiscovered primate? A relic species? Something paranormal? I don't have the answers. I'm just a lineman. All I have is my experience. I know what I saw. It was a creature of flesh and blood, as real as you or I. It was powerful, it was intelligent, and it was ancient. You can feel the age of it just by being in its presence. It belongs here in a way we never will. My advice to anyone who spends time in the deep woods is this: pay attention. Turn off the music. Put down the phone. Listen to the forest. If the birds and squirrels go silent, there's a reason. If you feel that weight of being watched, don't ignore it. Back away slowly. Get back to your car. Get back to the safe, explainable world. Don't let your curiosity or your ego get you into a situation you can't get out of. I still have to work out there sometimes. It's my job. But I'm different now. I carry a bigger gun, and I'm not ashamed of it. I pay more attention to the quiet moments than the loud ones. And I look at that dense, dark tree line, not as a place of recreation, but as a boundary, a border between our world and theirs. The thing that haunts me the most, the image that comes to me in the quiet hours of the night, is not the claws or the teeth. It's the eyes, that calm, curious, intelligent gaze, the look of a creature that has watched our comings and goings for centuries, a silent, patient landlord observing the temporary tenants. It's the look of something that knows the woods and the dark far better than we ever will, and it knows we don't belong there.